New Orleans Saints linebacker Chase Hansen makes his case to make the roster. Dwayne Washington takes control of the running back 3 battle, and some players are going to be looking for a very important bounce back week against the Packers next week. We got all of that and a little bit of Lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget that we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, Saints Wire over at USA Today, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at BetOnline. They've got more odds, lines, and props than ever before. Go and check them out today. BetOnline, where the game starts. On today's episode, the New Orleans Saints might have dropped their preseason game 17-13 against the Houston Texans, but it's all about the individual performances. So we'll take a look at players that help themselves and players that are going to be looking for a big bounce back week if they get the opportunity with the joint practices and Green Bay Packers preseason game coming up all next week. We'll also take a look at and kind of end on a big kind of positive note. The New Orleans Saints first team, or the first team that took the field, looked really good. So we'll break all of that down and, of course, get you that Lagniappe as we kick off today's episode with our sort of stock up watch, if you will. So I've got 5 players here that I think really helped themselves when it came to their performances on Saturday night up against the Houston Texans. And so I'm going to start off with linebacker Chase Hansen, because in terms of the players that helped themselves most positively, he might have had the biggest and best performance of the day. Of course, everyone's going to remember the big interception that he had. He had the big interception return as well. But if you look at that entire stat line, 5 combined tackles, 2 tackles for a loss, including the second or first play. I think it was actually just the first play of the game. He had the tackle for a loss in a backfield, interception, pass defense, and also had a special teams tackle as well. So just the value that you saw from Chase Hansen is one that, I mean, maybe kind of helps you think a little bit more and kind of more positively about the Saints linebacker depth. I know that injuries are always going to kind of be the big factor. And right now, Pete Werner dealing with a groin injury is a big deal because we know that those can kind of be recurring flare-ups. You can have a lot of issues there. Recurring issues there, that maybe that's something that ends up rearing its ugly head at some point during the season. But the way that Chase Hansen played and the way that Eric Wilson played as well, number 58, who actually deflected the pass, or not deflected the pass, but kind of had the pass defense against Dameon Pierce, who those Houston commentators were just in love with all game, that ended up knocking the ball into the air where Chase Hansen was able to pick it off in the tip drill. You feel pretty good there. But I think one of the big questions is that when you see how well Chase Hansen performed, you see how well Eric Wilson performed, and then you know how much the Saints love Andrew Dowell, is Zach Bond just an odd man out here as he deals with injury and wasn't even able to get out on the field for the first preseason game? So we don't even have a real evaluation of him. So definitely just something to continue to watch in terms of the linebacker battle for the New Orleans Saints. But the linebacker battle's fun. The running back battle got even more fun last night. That was a lot of fun to watch. We basically saw, for lack of a better phrase, I know it's not perfect, but for lack of a better phrase, we basically saw a quarter for each running back, right? We saw Dwayne Washington in the first. We saw a lot of Tony Jones Jr. in the third. We saw a lot of Devon Azigbo in the third. And then we saw a lot of Abram Smith in the fourth. And I think that Abram Smith did himself a lot of favors up until the fumble in the red zone, which you never want to see. But still kind of showed you that, hey, he deserves maybe some earlier carries the next game. I thought Devon Azigbo toted the rock well. I thought Tony Jones Jr. looked like the usual preseason all-star that he showed you last year. But for me, Dwayne Washington was far and away the better of the backs. Now, Dwayne Washington had his own fumble as well, but didn't give it up. He ended up recovering it as well. But he had 9 carries for 19 yards, averaged only 2.1 yards per carry. So that's where you really like Abram Smith's numbers, who had 4.3 yards per carry. But you also had the screen pass for the touchdown, the 9-yard touchdown, which we'll break down a little bit later today, but I thought Dwayne Washington did a good job building off of the confidence that he told us that he had started to really pick up over the course of this offseason. So really, really good to see that. Jumping over to the defensive side for the first time here, safety Justin Evans. He was one of those players that we said that we were going to watch very closely going into this matchup because he's just one of those players that has a lot of talent, but people kind of have forgotten about. 2020, he started the season on the physically unable to perform list and then didn't see the field that year. 2021, he kind of stepped away from the NFL, focused on rehabilitation, getting right, taking care of himself, getting back into the game once he was healthy, got back into the game, and New Orleans Saints gave him a shot, and he made good on it yesterday. We saw sort of the big hit potential that he brings because he is a heck of a hitter. But then we also saw him with his own tip drill interception as well. DeMarcus Fields doing a good job closing up some field on an underthrown pass by Jeff Driscoll, ended up affecting the catch point, gets tipped into the air, and then Justin Evans makes a diving catch, gets a pretty good return on it as well. So I thought Justin Evans did a good job helping himself out as well because, look, you're looking for some depth there in terms of safety. You've got Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu at the top, but Marcus May is very likely to miss a few games at the beginning of the season with his outstanding DUI case. After that, you've got JT Gray, who's your core special teamer. You've got PJ Williams, who they're having to focus in on safety. But if you want to keep a fifth safety, especially knowing how much playing time JT Gray is going to get, even without seeing the field as a defender, Justin Evans, Daniel Sorensen, I'm going to take Justin Evans in that case. I just think he's a little bit more of a playmaker. We saw that last night. Staying on the defensive side, this is a name for a guy that's had a really, really good offseason. So this isn't new news at all, but Paulson Adebo looked really good. And I think that the highlight here in terms of him being sort of a stock up player is relative because the stock was already high when it came to Paulson Adebo. But just seeing him take what we have seen from him over the course of camp, translate it and perform extremely well during this preseason matchup. We saw the big tackle for a loss in the second play of the game. He was breaking on the third down play in the Houston Texans opening drive as the ball was being thrown, helping to force the receiver out of bounds, which led to the punt, which then led to the offense marching down the field and scoring on their opening drive, which we didn't see a lot of in 2021. So I just think that, what you saw from Paulson Adebo just reflects more on what we have seen from him over the course of camp and kind of confirms, he can still be this guy at game speed. Now, he's going to face much, much better receivers throughout 2022 than he did Saturday night, but still good to see him be able to help to string it all together. And speaking of how good to see, my final guy in terms of stock up, Cesar Ruiz. Look, Cesar Ruiz started off concerning because the very first rep that he took, he got beat by Ross Blacklock on a swim move to his outside shoulder. But after that, he locked up really well. And on that 9-yard screen pass, he had a really nice play to where he engaged with the defensive tackle, kind of allowed the defensive tackle to beat him to the outside away from where the screen was going, flipped his hips, and then got to the point where he was able to seal to make sure that there was no backside pressure coming on that screen pass. I thought he executed extremely well. A lot of people are going to talk about, Andrus Peat and Eric McCoy, and rightfully so. But I thought Cesar Ruiz played his role in the execution of that screen pass perfectly well. So those are my 5 stock up. Just to recap them real quick: Chase Hansen, linebacker, running back Dwayne Washington, safety Justin Evans, cornerback Paulson Adebo, and then guard Cesar Ruiz. I also have to just quickly mention wide receiver Dai'Jean Dixon. 3 catches, 33 yards, second leading receiver of the game, highest receiver in terms of yardage for the New Orleans Saints. He had a phenomenal game last night as well. Exactly what you wanted to see from the Nickel State, dare I say, legend. Coming up next, we're talking about the guys that didn't necessarily help themselves and could potentially be on the chopping block. Remember, the Saints have 5 players that they'll have to cut before they get into practice next week. But also, even if they don't get cut, they're going to need a big performance next week in the joint practices and going up against the Green Bay Packers on Friday. So we're going to break those down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Before we get to that, it is my great pleasure to tell you all about my friends over at BetterHelp. I'm a big-time believer in therapy. You've heard me talk about it before here on the show, and I will continue to talk about it because I understand the value of it. I didn't before. I do now. I was one of those people. Didn't believe that I needed it, all of that, but also didn't understand that there was a way to get it conveniently. And that's where BetterHelp comes in and has made it an even more enjoyable experience. Look, it's always good to have somebody to talk to, but it's not easy to find those people sometimes. And that's why I love BetterHelp. You jump onto the website, you do it on your phone or your computer. You basically just answer some questions about yourself, and then BetterHelp finds a therapist, licensed therapist, that is a good match for you. But then they also don't charge you if you decide that it's not a good fit and you want to switch to a different therapist. That's one of the things that I love about BetterHelp. They want to make sure that this is a positive experience for you, and they have several ways of getting it done. So you can check it all out over at betterhelp.com. And just to help you out here, we're going to make sure that you get 10% off of your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon, LOCKEDON. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can see it right here. That's 10% off of your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks again, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. So now we kind of discussed the guys that, help themselves. Now let's talk a little bit and break down a little bit the guys that didn't necessarily help themselves. And remember, the Saints have to cut 5 players before they get into practice next week. And some of these guys are going to be players that could potentially be on that list. Others are players that are definitely going to make the roster, but, are fighting for positioning. And then others are guys that, you're wanting to see them stack good performances getting into the cut down to 53. So I'll try to define sort of the variety of different sort of like stock downs, quote unquote, we're about to discuss here. So let's start off with a guy that's definitely not going to get cut before next week, but that is, still fighting for his positioning within the team. Could end up being a practice squad guy, could end up being on the roster, things like that. And that is quarterback Ian Book. Ian Book had a rough game last night. Now, did he have the worst game in the world? No. He also had some really nice moments, right? We saw a couple of really nice throws and the over routes and things like that to the opposite side, to the right side of the field over to Dai'Jean Dixon. We saw a couple of other nice throws that even went to the opposite side of the field. But one of the things that I observed during training camp was Ian Book's sort of the difference between him throwing to the right side of the field versus coming across his body and throwing to the left side of the field. And he seems to be a lot more comfortable throwing over to the right, which makes sense, right? You're not kind of turning your body and throwing over yourself. You're throwing in your sort of natural eye line. So that's definitely something you have to get fixed, though, because if you're going to be an NFL quarterback, you got to be able to throw accurately everywhere on the field, right? From left to right. And so we saw that kind of issue last night with the high pass to Juwan Johnson over to the left side of the field. Juwan Johnson he went up, tried to catch it, ended up getting tipped up in the air and then intercepted. Should have been a Jalen Petrie interception. As a Jalen Petrie stan throughout his draft process, I am very comfortable saying that interception was stolen from him, but that's not what we're here to talk about. But we saw that. We saw another high pass that left side of the field again a little bit later. We also saw 2 botched snap exchanges as well. So the Saints had 3 turnovers last night, and Ian Book literally had a hand in 2 of those. So that's not great. Now, he also had a touchdown pass to Tre'Quan Smith that Tre'Quan Smith just kind of blatantly dropped. Maybe things go a little bit differently in terms of momentum and confidence after that, but you're not always going to get those, right? So if you don't get those, you got to be able to show your ability to bounce back, your ability to respond, all of that. So that's what I'll be looking forward to seeing next week. He's going to be seeing unfamiliar faces all next week, going up against the Green Bay Packers during training camp, sort of their joint practices on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then, of course, Friday with the game in Green Bay. So what I want to see from Ian Book is his ability to respond, which is something as a quarterback you have to be able to do in the first place. Another player that's definitely going to make the roster, right? Like, he's 100% going to make the roster in this case, in terms of the 53-man roster, but is battling for positioning and didn't really do himself any favors last night is Trevor Penning. Trevor Penning struggled a bit last night. I mean, any edge rusher that was in front of him, there were a couple of guys that found a lot of success, either with speed moves to the inside, which we've seen. We also saw him struggle with some speed moves to the outside as well. So Trevor Penning, not in a situation where he's going to be cut before practices or that he's not going to make the 53-man roster. He's making the 53-man roster, right? Like, he's their he was their second of 2 first round selections. That's not what we're saying here. It's all relative, but he is battling for positioning. And so last week we kind of got to the point where we were talking like, oh, maybe that left tackle battle between him and James Hurst is a little bit more narrow than we realized. And then we spoke about it on Saturday morning with our Players to Watch episode about either today or either in that game against the Texans, the gap was going to widen again, or it was going to narrow further because he was able to do it in full game action. I think now the gap has widened a little bit more. So a big bounce back performance for him next week would go far in terms of keeping pace, in terms of battling for that starting left tackle spot. But it's clear that he's got things to work on that are all addressable and stuff. And so we'll see how he's able to respond next week. Now, I'm kind of going to go 2 for 1 here. I'm going to cheating a little bit. DeMarcus Fields and Vincent Gray, both of these guys, neither of these guys did themselves any favors last night. Vincent Gray struggled quite a bit early on in the game. DeMarcus Fields struggled throughout the game. Now, he did have the nice sort of play on the underthrown ball. He had another nice play on the left sideline where he got his hands up, but he didn't turn around. But then we just saw in that last drive, him and Brian Allen in particular. So really, we could put all three of these guys together. Him and Brian Allen and Vincent Gray all struggled, but DeMarcus Fields and Brian Allen just melted down in the fourth quarter. And the Saints played 58 minutes of really good defensive football, and then all of a sudden, Brian Allen comes off of the interception and then blows a coverage and then ends up, blowing one coverage and then just getting like beat on another coverage. And then DeMarcus Fields in the red zone is the most outside defensive player. The Texans come out in a trip sort of bunch over on the far side if you're watching from the screen, and DeMarcus Fields passes off to the outside, and there's nobody to pass off to because he's the outside most defender. So little moments like that, like those are going to hurt you in the preseason because they show sort of a lack of understanding of where you are, what your responsibilities are, and your relationship to the rest of the team, the rest of the unit on defense. So those are pretty detrimental moments. So DeMarcus Fields, Brian Allen, Vincent Gray, even though Brian Allen had the interception, those would all be names to continue to watch going into next week. And then finally, again, a guy that's not going to get cut before next week, but is battling for a roster spot when it comes to the 53-man roster is wide receiver Tre'Quan Smith. Now, Smith was drafted by the New Orleans Saints up until Chris Olave was selected. He was the highest drafted wide receiver that the Saints had invested in since Michael Thomas back in 2016. And we've seen it over and over again. The promise, the exciting moments, his ability, his toughness, his good, he's got good hands in the middle, things like that. But he has never really panned out to be the guy that we all expected that he would be coming out of UCF. And some of that was the role that he was asked to play in the NFL was different than his role at UCF, where he was a little bit more of a deep threat there. Then he was asked to play in the slot once he got to the NFL. But then now we've seen him get some real opportunities to be an X receiver, a Z receiver, do all of those things that we thought he would be able to do coming out of college. And we didn't see that. And now in this preseason game, he's got the big drop in the end zone. He has a couple of other little flubs, things like that. Like those things add up, especially when you got a guy like Dai'Jean Dixon leading the team with 33 receiving yards, or Marquez Callaway having that big 19-yard catch and run on the 3rd and 5 from Andy Dalton early on in the game in that first series. And so you already know this is a crowded wide receiver room. There's 4 spots already claimed. Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, Jarvis Landry, not in that order, and then Deontay Hardy, who's going to be your return specialist. Marquez Callaway's right up there for 5. Guys like Dai'Jean Dixon and Kirk Merritt also battling for that spot. Easop Winston battling for that spot. And so even if the Saints keep 6, you still have competition for that 6th spot too. So it's a little bit tough right now for Tre'Quan Smith, who has to have another big bounce back week going up against the Green Bay Packers throughout joint practices and the game on Friday. So those are our 5 kind of players that didn't necessarily help themselves. Quarterback Ian Book, left tackle Trevor Penning, 3 defensive backs in DeMarcus Fields, Vincent Gray, and Brian Allen, and then Tre'Quan Smith, New Orleans Saints wide receiver. Now, I never want to end on a bad note, so let's end on a positive note. What you should feel good about is Andy Dalton and that New Orleans Saints first team, because they were dominant on offense to open up the game. We'll break all of that down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, which is brought to you by our friends over at BetOnline, our online gambling partners here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and your number one source for all sports wagering information, podcasts, articles, trends, action, odds, lines, props. They got it all over at BetOnline, which you can visit on your mobile device or your laptop from wherever, whenever, and check out everything that they've got going on over at the website. So if you took the Saints to win last night, stop betting on preseason games, but also there's so much more that you could check out. End of year awards, the regular season lines are starting to come up, all of that stuff. There's also the NBA, the MLB, the NHL, esports, golf, combat sports, so much for you to check out. And they've got it all for you over at BetOnline. where the game starts. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with positive note, what you should be excited about, what you should be happy about seeing from last night's game. The New Orleans Saints, even though they lost the Houston Texans, remember what we said last week, these preseason games are about individual evaluation, not about team success. So you don't take a loss too much to heart here. But what you can take to heart is just how good the New Orleans Saints were in their opening offensive drive. Remember, we either didn't or only saw a couple of opening drive scores, field goal or touchdowns. We only saw a couple of those in 2021. So to see this offense come in and march down the field to open up the drive, and for Andy Dalton to go a perfect 5 of 5, and for Dwayne Washington to pick up a couple of really good runs throughout all of that as well, and then for it to all end in a touchdown on the opening drive, that's promising. That's good news, because that's not even really your first team, right? There was no Michael Thomas. There was no Jarvis Landry. There was no Jameis Winston, right? Like, this was your first and a half team, right? This was something in between your first and second team. But led by Andy Dalton, this team looked outstanding, marching down the field and getting a touchdown to open up the game. So I wanted to just kind of break down a little bit of what we saw and why you should feel good about it. So let's start off here. I'm just looking over at the playlist for the moment. But let's start off here from the first and 10. So we saw a couple of different runs from Dwayne Washington throughout this. We saw a 2-yard run at one point. Picked up a couple of extra yards all throughout and all. So he got a couple of runs early on. But the big thing here was the passing acuity, the prowess in the passing game that the Saints brought in. 15 yards to Tre'Quan Smith, 4 yards to Dwayne Washington, 19 yards to Marquez Callaway. You also saw 4 yards to Adam Troutman, and then finally the 9-yard touchdown on the screen pass to Dwayne Washington. So that made Andy Dalton a perfect 5 of 5. We know the value of Andy Dalton on the sideline, but this is the value of Andy Dalton if Jameis Winston has to run off to put his helmet back on or tie his shoe or whatever. This is the value of Andy Dalton, that you can still run this offense with him, even when there are some major pieces missing, like Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry and Alvin Kamara and, all of the players that were not a part of this unit in terms of its quote unquote first team. So this was good stuff, really, really good stuff to see how efficiently this offense moved, even with some of those key pieces missing. The thing that I loved most was that we started to see the Saints during training camp last week really work on the screen game. We had that big 60-yard or so catch and run by Tony Jones Jr. We saw early on in camp, Devine Azigbo took a screen for a big gain as well. So for them to come back and then have the big touchdown here on the 9-yard screen makes a lot of sense, right? We saw the Saints working on that. So expect the screen to the running backs out of the backfield, and we even saw a tight end screen in Nick Van Nett at another point. Expect to see that continue to be woven into the New Orleans Saints offense. This is Pete Carmichael, right? This is still the same New Orleans Saints offense that we're accustomed to seeing, maybe a little bit more untethered. I don't know. We'll find out. So the Saints, even though they were focusing on their run game and trying to figure out like who was going to be that person to come out of here and that running back battle to be, the top option or toption, then that ends up giving you this really good insight as to like, yeah, the Saints are working on their run game, but their passing game, it's really good. And it's much better than it was last year, that's for sure. So on the 9-yard screen pass touchdown to Dwayne Washington, everything was set up very well. The offensive line set it up extremely well. You heard me talk about and break down sort of Cesar Ruiz's moment there to where he was able to engage in the block, get that defensive lineman to over pursue toward the inside, get his body turned so he could seal off any backside pressure. But the best part of it all was Andrus Peat and Eric McCoy out in front of Dwayne Washington blocking, and Dwayne Washington just making the move because you had 2 blockers and 3 defenders. So technically, Dwayne Washington was outnumbered. So it's his job to set up that third defender to make sure that he can get past. So what did he do? He had Andrus Peat kind of toward the outside, a little bit closer to the sideline, had Eric McCoy a little bit further on the inside. So there's a little bit of a gap in between the 2 offensive linemen. Dwayne Washington starts his angle toward the inside in between them and then breaks back outside, or rather inside, of Eric McCoy toward the center of the field to be able to walk in for the touchdown. So very well executed on all points from this New Orleans Saints first team offensive line, and the guy that is really making his claim to be the third running back on this team. And one of the big things that Dwayne Washington is trying to show you is that, yeah, he can be a core special teamer, but he's going to be able to catch out of the backfield. He's going to be able to run from the backfield as well. So he's going to be able to actually be an asset on offense. That's what he wants to prove. Did a great job proving that in that play, but also throughout the rest of the night. Just got to keep his hands, just got to keep the ball in his hands. Just got to keep the ball in his hands. That's the only thing. All right, let's get to today's Lagniappe. I love doing this. So getting to today's Lagniappe, as I get this changed over on the screen, it's really, really nice for this team to have Wil Lutz back. Like, let's be honest. How many of y'all didn't even look at the screen when Wil Lutz went out to kick a field goal? I'll raise my hand. I don't mind that. I forgot what that was like, right? Like, to see Wil Lutz go out to take the field goal. I think you can see it in the extra point too, right? Like, how many of you just like went to your phone? I went to the phone. I started checking stats and everything, getting ready to fire off all my tweets and stuff, and just didn't have to worry about it. And that's so nice because that ends up being the difference in games for you. Remember, the Saints had 2 games that they lost last year that were, less than 1 score, less than 1 field goal. So when you have a guy like that who can go out there and just knock in a 23-yard field goal, you don't have to worry about it. I don't know, you really had that confidence last year with Aldrick Rosas and Brian Johnson and Cody Parkey and all these guys, right? Like, you didn't really have that same level of confidence, even for a chip shot, because you didn't have it for the extra points. The extra points weren't surefire, so even the short field goals, you couldn't be comfortable about. Now, comfortable. Chilling. It was nice. It's really, really nice for this New Orleans Saints team to have Wil Lutz back. And I think that's going to end up translating to a couple of extra dubs for them in 2022. If nothing else, right? A couple of tighter games. For sure. All right, y'all. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to take a look at the position battles, right? We're going to update the position battles. We spoke quite a bit about running back, but who are the players that really help themselves in their other position battles as well, including, of course, your position battle for their starting left tackle. And I think hopefully we'll get some news about roster cuts, things like that. So we'll break all of that down as we learn more all throughout the week. We're back to 2-a-days on Tuesday and Wednesday when it comes to the Packers joint practices, which I'll be present for. So we'll get live shows Tuesday and Wednesday afternoon with the pre-recorded shows and answers to your questions in the evening. I appreciate y'all very much. As always, make Locked On Saints a part of your day. For your second listen today, make sure you go and check out Locked On Fantasy Football and check out our friends over at Locked On Dynasty Football as well, getting you ready for your upcoming fantasy football drafts and your fantasy football season, available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Appreciate you as always for making me a part of your day, a part of your routine, and for saying yes to me and this show. As always, if you see me, say hi, and for everything else you need in between these episodes and your New Orleans Saints, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up, let me know how the family's doing, let me know how you're living, let me know how your mom and them, and trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.